They say life gets easier with age. That time heals wounds, and that wisdom softens the sharp edges of pain. But for Eleanor Briggs, 42 and alone life felt heavier than ever. She wasn't some young, fresh-faced bride dreaming of lace and wildflowers. She was a woman who had known the cold sting of judgment, the silence of empty kitchens, and the ache of being overlooked. Not once, but many, many times. And yet, she still believed in love. Quietly, fiercely, even if no one else did. That's why she boarded the train that morning, hands trembling around a worn leather case, a letter tucked into her bodice from a man named Everett Barnes, a rancher in Wyoming Territory, seeking a wife through the mail. He had seen her photograph, knew her age. She had even told him plainly that she was a woman of full size, not fat, just honest. She refused to hide behind corsets or false promises. And Everett had written back, "What I want is not a figure. It's a home, a partner. Someone who can carry half a life with grace." Eleanor clung to those words like a lifeline. Maybe, just maybe this time would be different. But when she stepped off the platform into the grit and wind of Rock Creek, Wyoming after 2 days on a train, and a life full of holding her breath, Everett took one look at her and paled. You're bigger than I thought," he muttered just loud enough for his hired hand to hear. And just like that, every bruise she had learned to bury came roaring back. The rejection was swift, public, and cruel in its familiarity. Everett didn't even walk her to town, just turned his back and rode away. The other men laughed under their breath. The station master offered her a bench to sit on until the afternoon train. But Eleanor didn't cry, not then. She sat still, spine straight, eyes dry like so many older women before her, trained to hide pain like it was a shameful secret. That's when a voice not loud but low and steady broke the silence. "Ma'am," he said, tapping his hat, "you got somewhere to be." She looked up. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with quiet gray eyes that studied her without flinching. "No," she replied, "not anymore." He nodded once. "Well," he said, "I've got stew on the fire and a spare mule. If you ain't got nowhere to go, might as well come in from the wind." She stared at him, stunned. "You don't even know me," she said. The man shrugged. "Reckon we all start as strangers." That was how Eleanor Briggs met Caleb Hawthorne, the man who didn't flinch when she said nothing, and the first man who ever truly saw her. The train pulled into Dead Horse Crossing with a screech that echoed off the sandstone cliffs, but no one stepped forward to meet the woman stepping down from the second passenger car. Her name was Eleanor Burke, and she clutched a hat box close to her chest as if it were armor. She was 38, not what most called young, and she was large, broad-hipped, soft-faced, with strong arms from years of kneading dough and hauling laundry water. Her cheeks flushed with the heat of shame before the desert sun ever touched her skin. No bouquet waited for her. No man tipped his hat, and yet she'd traveled 3 days by rail with hope packed tightly inside her corset, wrapped around a letter from a man named Mr. Everett Langley, a rancher who had written with polite interest and sturdy penmanship. He had asked for a wife with strong hands and a kind nature. She'd sent her photo, he'd never replied. Still she came. The station master glanced at her with half pity and returned to his papers. A group of teenage boys on horseback rode past and snickered loud enough for her to hear. "Looks like Langley ordered 2 women in one." She lowered her eyes and pretended not to understand. Inside the general store, she asked for directions to the Langley ranch. The clerk's face fell. "You Langley's male bride?" She nodded. "Well," he left a note. "Told me to give it to you if you came." Her hands trembled as she unfolded the brief message. "Miss Burke's circumstances have changed. I've taken another offer closer to home. I wish you the best in finding suitable arrangements elsewhere. E. Langley." That was it. No apology, no explanation. Just discarded like bruised fruit. Eleanor stood in that store humiliated beyond speech, her hat box slipping from her fingers as tears threatened to fall. The other shoppers tried not to stare, but their silence was worse than words. "What did you expect?" someone muttered near the pickle barrel. "You can't send a picture like that and think he'll show up." She ran. Not far, just to the bench outside where the horses were tied. She sat there for nearly an hour, too stunned to think. Her corset bit into her ribs. Her knees ached. The heat clung to her skin like shame. It wasn't just rejection, it was confirmation of everything she feared, that she wasn't what men wanted. That kindness didn't matter when you took up too much space. As afternoon shadows crept over the town, a voice interrupted her spiral. "Ma'am, you dropped this." A man stood beside her, tall and quiet, with a long coat dusted from the trail. He held out her hat box, now scuffed but intact. His eyes were steady, not mocking. One of them bore a scar near the brow. He looked about her age, maybe older, and wore his weariness like a second skin. "I saw what happened in the store," he said, soft as worn leather. "Wasn't right." She took the hat box with numb fingers. "It's nothing, just a mistake." "No, ma'am," he said. "A mistake is forgetting your keys. That was cruelty." He tipped his hat and started to walk away, but she stopped him. "What's your name?" "Caleb Hart. I've got a ranch west of here. Came to town for flower and fence nails." He looked her in the eye, not the body. "Reckon I've got more room than I need if you're looking for a place to stay for a few days." Eleanor hesitated. She had nothing, nowhere to go. And yet this man, this total stranger, had looked at her like she was still human. Still worth speaking to. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I don't want pity." Caleb shook his head. "I don't give pity, miss. I offer a porch swing, warm food, and a roof. That's all." She rose slowly, clutching her hat box. "I'll take the swing if it's not too much." He smiled just a little. "Then let's go before the sun melts us both." And that's how it began. Not with vows or flowers or romance, but with dignity, with space to breathe, with the smallest kindness from a man who didn't flinch when he looked at her. That night, as Eleanor sat beneath the stars on a stranger's porch, a question burned quietly in her chest. What if kindness could grow where love once died? Caleb's wagon was old, the kind with creaking wheels and a split canvas top, but it carried Eleanor safely through the miles of sage and silence. The prairie air had cooled by dusk, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. He didn't speak much, which suited her just fine. When he did, his voice was low and matter-of-fact. "I live alone. Been that way a while." She glanced sideways, by choice. He gave a shrug, by timing and consequence. That night they reached his ranch just as the stars blinked awake. It wasn't much, just a two-room house, a weathered barn, and a swing hanging from the porch like an old memory. But to Eleanor, it looked like sanctuary. Inside, it smelled of cedarwood and baked beans. Caleb lit a lantern, handed her a clean towel, and showed her the small guest cot by the kitchen. "You can stay here for a few days till you figure out what's next," he said, scratching the back of his neck like the offer made him nervous. Eleanor didn't argue. She was too tired to pretend she had anywhere else to go. The next morning she rose early, already feeling in the way. She tried to help with breakfast, but her hands trembled as she cracked the eggs. Caleb said nothing, only nodded when she offered to clean up. "Thank you again," she said quietly, unsure of how much space she was allowed to take up. "You're not a burden," he replied without looking up. "I wouldn't have asked you here if I thought otherwise." That silenced her. It wasn't the words, it was the tone, like he meant it, like it didn't cost him anything to make space for her. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor watched him work. He fixed the gate, gathered firewood, brushed down the mare, with the gentleness of someone who'd seen enough violence to choose quiet instead. He limped slightly on his right leg, but never spoke of it. He didn't flirt. He didn't leer. And for the first time in years, Eleanor didn't feel like her body was a stage for someone else's judgment. At night, they sat on the porch swing. He let her speak when she needed to, asked nothing when she couldn't. "Why were you really in town that day?" she finally asked one evening, her voice barely above the cricket song. "Suppose I was hoping to see something good," he said in a place that's been mostly cruel. She turned to look at him, heart-thudding. "I didn't expect you to call me good." "I didn't call you good," he said gently. "I said I saw it." And again, she didn't know what to say. "Say you run to him." On the fourth day, she baked a loaf of sourdough. It wasn't much, but the smell filled the house, and Caleb ate 2 slices before speaking. "My sister used to bake like that," he murmured. "Told me once, you can always tell a woman's hope by the way she kneads dough." Never understood what she meant. Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's in the way we fold the air into something that can rise." He looked at her, then really looked. Not with pity, not even admiration, but with recognition. And that shook her more than anything Everett Langley had ever done. That evening, she saw herself in the mirror above the wash basin. She was still big, still round, but her eyes looked different, brighter maybe, or less braced for harm. She whispered to her reflection, "Don't fall too fast, Eleanor." But the truth was she already had. Then came Sunday. The church bell rang in town, and Caleb offered to hitch the wagon, but Eleanor shook her head. "I'm not ready to go where people remember me as a rejection." He didn't argue. Instead, he walked out to the field and returned with a flower wild purple and clinging to its last days of bloom. He handed it to her wordlessly, then sat beside her on the swing. And she wept. Not for Everett, not even for the years she'd spent trying to shrink herself to fit, but for the strange, quiet man who made her feel not thin, not pretty, not small, but whole, as kindness grew between them. Eleanor wrestled with an ache she'd long buried. What if love did exist, but only if she dared to believe she was worthy of it? There were days when Eleanor felt weightless in Caleb's presence, not because her body had changed, but because his eyes never measured it. He treated her like she was made of something sturdier than shame, and for a woman who had spent decades trying to disappear into doorframes, that was a strange kind of grace. And yet the voices in her mind hadn't gone silent. They rose in the quietest hours when he handed her a plate without hesitation, when he looked up from his work just to make sure she was warm, or when he left the last biscuit on the plate as if she were the one who deserved it. Why would he? What does he see? How long until he changes his mind too? Eleanor knew rejection too well to believe in kindness without an escape route. She'd lived her life with one hand on the doorknob, just in case. Prairie de. One morning while washing clothes by the well, she overheard two women from the neighboring ranch talking. "That's the bride Everett Langley sent away, ain't it?" one whispered. "The fat one," the other said. "I heard he paid extra to keep her name out of the papers." Eleanor didn't let herself cry, not where anyone could see. But that evening she skipped supper, claimed a headache, lay on the cot in silence while Caleb ate alone. He knocked once on her door. "Soup's hot if you want any." She didn't answer, and after a long pause he walked away. Her shame clawed at her chest, not because she was judged, but because part of her believed those women were right. As so much. The next day Caleb didn't press her. He was kind, quiet, kept his distance. And somehow that hurt worse, because she realized she wanted him to fight for her. Not because she thought she deserved it, but because she wanted to be someone worth staying for. Sorry everyone, Sartre. That night Eleanor stood barefoot on the porch wrapped in a blanket, staring at the moon. Caleb came out, stood beside her, didn't speak for a while. Finally he said, "You think I don't hear things, Eleanor?" "Just 'cause I don't say much." She turned hard in her throat. "But I do. I hear plenty. I just don't repeat what ain't useful." She blinked at him. "You're not a rumor," he continued. "You're not what he said or what they whisper. You're the woman who brought life into this house with one loaf of bread, who fixed my shirt without being asked, who laughs like someone who's had to rebuild her voice from scraps." Tears spilled over before she could stop them. "I'm scared," she confessed. "You're kind, but I've been here before. You know, for a minute they look at me like I matter, and then they see what I really am." "What do you think you are?" She hesitated. Too much, not enough, both. He exhaled slowly, reached out not to touch her, but to hold the space between them. "I don't want to fix you, Eleanor. I just want to be near you while you remember you're not broken." The next morning something shifted. She woke early, baked cornbread, and left a note beside his coffee. "I'll be back around noon," had something to settle. She hitched the wagon and rode into town. Alone. Straight to the dress shop where Everett Langley's bride had once been measured and dismissed. She walked in, met the seamstress's eyes, and asked to be fitted for a new dress. "Any particular reason?" the woman asked, trying not to look surprised. "Yes," Eleanor said, chin high. "Because I have a place to go, and I'm done dressing for permission." Surtout. That afternoon, she returned wearing blue soft cotton hand-stitched buttons and sleeves that fit just right. Caleb was on the porch. When he saw her, he stood slowly. And he smiled, not wide, not dramatic, but like someone who'd been holding his breath and just remembered how to exhale. "You look like yourself," he said. She laughed softly, maybe for the first time in a long while. He stepped forward, hand gentle against her elbow. "Then I'm real glad I was here to see it. But love, real love, doesn't bloom without light." And now that Eleanor had stepped out of the shadows, the question wasn't if she was worthy, but whether she'd dare to choose joy at last. A week passed and something about Eleanor began to soften. Not in body, but in presence. The way she stirred a pot without apologizing for the smell, or how she left her hair unpinned, letting it curl where it pleased. The porch had become her favorite place, where silence didn't accuse, but embraced. And still one evening, as the light burned amber over the field, she found herself staring at the only mirror in the house, a chipped thing above the wash basin in the hallway. She turned it face down. She wasn't angry, just tired of looking for someone else's reflection in her own face. We, Later that night, they sat across from one another by the fire, a rare chill in the New Mexico wind curling under the door. Caleb was oiling his boots. Eleanor was mending a tear in his sleeve. It had become their ritual, companionable silence, no explanations needed. But that night the silence felt heavy, like something unsaid had taken a seat at the table. Eleanor looked up, her hands stilled. "Did you know," she asked softly, "that Everett told me I'd humiliate him if I stepped off the train?" Caleb didn't answer, but his jaw tensed. "He said I was a misrepresentation," she continued. "Said the photo made me look smaller, that if he married me, people would think he was desperate." Her eyes glistened, but her voice didn't shake. "I sat on that bench in front of the post office for 6 hours before someone finally asked if I needed help. 6 hours where I told myself maybe I deserved it." Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "You didn't." "I know that now," she said. "But back then, rejection felt like confirmation. Like the world had been whispering the same thing all along. I'm too much. I take up too much space. My hunger, my laughter, my tears. Everything's a little too loud, too visible." She folded the shirt slowly. "But then you looked at me like I wasn't something to fix. Like maybe I could just exist. I didn't know how much I needed that." Caleb spoke, then voice raspy like it had to climb out of someplace deep. "I grew up quiet. People thought I was slow, dumb. No one taught me how to speak with my hands till I was almost grown. By then I'd learned the world only listens to voices that shout." He looked at her. "You never had to shout, not once, and I heard you anyway." She blinked back tears. "I don't know how to be loved like that." Caleb leaned closer. "You don't have to. You just have to stay." The next morning, Eleanor cooked breakfast for the first time without checking her reflection. She wore the blue dress. She greeted the day not with apology, but with warmth. She placed a fresh-cut flower in the center of the table, not for anyone else, just because it made her smile. And when Caleb came in from tending the horse's mud on his boots and straw in his beard, he paused in the doorway like he'd walked into something sacred. He didn't speak, just crossed the room and took her hand in his. "Stay," he said again. "I am," she whispered, "and I will." Wakan Arsamen. That night they danced, no music, no watchers, just the hush of the wind and the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Caleb held her like a man who understood that some women weren't made for dainty waltzes, but for holding up the roof when the wind howled. And Eleanor finally let her heart stop bracing for impact, because the storm had passed. And the man who remained didn't flinch at her weight, her quiet, or her ache. He just stayed. She had once believed her size made her hard to love, but it was her strength, her softness, and her steady presence that made her unforgettable. Now that she had chosen to stay, would love choose her back, forever. In the weeks that followed, their lives unfolded like a quiet hymn. Nothing grand, no sweeping declarations, just the everyday miracles that happen when two people stop running and start staying. The kitchen became their chapel. Caleb would come in from the fields and Eleanor would be there, flower on her cheek sleeves, rolled up, humming a tune half remembered from her mother. He never interrupted. He simply stood in the doorway for a while, listening, watching, as though to disturb her rhythm would be sacrilege. And sometimes she'd look up, catch him watching, and blush, though he never made her feel ashamed. They shared bread before it cooled. They tasted soup straight from the ladle. And one night when she accidentally spilled stew across the floor, Caleb bent down beside her, not to scold, but to help, both of them laughing until their stomachs ached. It was the first time Eleanor had laughed that way in years. A belly-deep joy, the kind that didn't worry about how it looked or sounded. He kissed her that night. It wasn't planned. He'd brought in a late bloom of desert sage he'd found near the fence line and handed it to her without a word. She reached to take it, and when her fingers brushed his, he looked at her for a long moment, like a man finding home. And then he kissed her. Not like she was delicate, not like she was a reward or a mercy, but like she was real, solid, precious. She didn't cry, though tears threatened. She only touched his face gently, stunned by the tenderness in his eyes. There was no hunger in the kiss, no urgency, just reverence. Fernandetibur and Washabarmin. They didn't speak of marriage right away. Neither needed to rush. There was something sacred about going slow. But one morning Eleanor found a ring box in her apron drawer, an old tarnished silver band set with a tiny opal. It didn't sparkle much, but when she slipped it on, it fit like it had been waiting for her all along. Caleb never said a word about it, just smiled the next time he saw it on her finger, kissed her knuckles, and went back to chopping firewood. Ewinder, make him. There were still hard days. Her hips ached when the weather shifted. The townspeople still stared when she walked beside Caleb in the market, whispers about the woman Everett abandoned. But Caleb never let go of her hand, not once. And Eleanor no longer flinched. She wasn't Everett's shame anymore. She was Caleb's joy. One Sunday, while packing supplies for the schoolhouse fundraiser, a woman approached her at the stall. "You're the mail-order girl, aren't you?" she asked, not unkindly. Eleanor nodded. The woman looked her up and down, then said softly, "My sister never got off that train." She couldn't bear the thought of rejection. Eleanor's heart caught. She should have, Eleanor said gently. The man might have rejected her, but someone else would have seen her. And if no one did, Eleanor smiled, full and certain, then she could have learned to see herself. Incarnatory Marshon. That night, Eleanor stood by the window as Caleb lit the lantern. "You think we'll always be this happy?" she asked. He looked up, his hands still on the match. "No," he said plainly, "but I think we'll always be real. And that's better." She nodded, tears in her eyes. Real sounds like forever. But even love that is real must be tested. When Everett returns remorseful and desperate, Eleanor must face the man who once broke her spirit and finally choose who she really is. It happened on a Thursday. A storm was brewing, low clouds coiled like bruises across the hills, and Caleb had ridden into town to collect seed. Eleanor stood on the porch, apron dusted with flour, watching the wind kick up dust. Then came the knock. Firm, familiar. She opened the door slowly, and there he was, Everett Barnes. Taller than she remembered, thinner too. His coat hung off him like it no longer fit, and time had put creases where vanity used to live. He took off his hat, eyes searching hers. "Eleanor," he said. She didn't answer, not right away. "I came to apologize," he added quickly. "I was wrong. I was stupid. And I've paid for it every day since." She said nothing but stepped aside, letting him into the kitchen. Something in her felt calm, solid, not out of forgiveness, but clarity. He looked around, noticing the fresh bread, the stitched linens, the pot of sage by the window. "You've done well for yourself," he said, trying for a smile. "No thanks to you." He winced. "I deserved that." She folded her hands over her apron. "Why are you really here, Everett?" He hesitated. "I heard you were still in town, that you never left, that you found someone." He looked down at his hands. "But then I thought maybe you hadn't married yet. Maybe there was still a chance." Eleanor's heart didn't flutter. It didn't crack. It simply stood still, listening. "You rejected me because I embarrassed you," she said flatly. "Not because you didn't know me, but because you didn't want to." "I was a fool," he said quickly. "My mother raised me to think appearances mattered more than decency. And when I saw you, I panicked. I didn't see the woman you are. I see her now." She stepped closer. "No, Everett. You see the woman he saw? Caleb. He didn't wait to see if I'd improve or grow on him. He simply stayed. He saw me on the worst day of my life and said, 'Come in.'" Everett lowered his head. I don't want to spend the rest of my life regretting. And I don't intend to spend the rest of mine being someone's regret," she answered. Her voice wasn't cruel, just clear. He stood. "Then I'll go." But before he reached the door, she said one last thing. "You did me a favor, Everett. You freed me from the illusion that love had to be earned through smallness." That evening, Caleb returned soaked from the rain. "You had a visitor," she said quietly. He paused, watching her. "Everett." "The restaurant." She nodded. Caleb didn't press, didn't ask what was said. He simply stepped forward and took her hand. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. "Not of him, not of the world, not anymore." He touched her cheek, brushing a damp curl away. "That's good," he said, "because I was never afraid of you." And there in the glow of the oil lamp, she realized something. She had finally chosen. Not just him, but herself. Some stories end in thunder. Others end in a quiet porch, 2 chairs, and the knowledge that this steady chosen love is what forever looks like. They never had a big wedding. There were no invitations, no white gown, no flowers lining the aisle. Just Caleb, Eleanor, Father Barnett, and 2 witnesses from town, an old widow who taught piano, and a blacksmith whose hands shook from years of honest labor. The vows were spoken on the front porch with the evening sun casting gold over the hills and a pie cooling on the sill behind them. "I do," she said, looking into eyes that never once flinched from her truth. "I always did," Caleb replied, his voice low and certain. They didn't kiss for show. They simply held each other like people who had known loss and chosen love anyway. Years passed the way they do in places with long winters and faithful livestock. Eleanor learned the rhythms of the ranch the way the snow whispered before it fell. The creak of the barn roof under weight, the prayer in Caleb's breath before sunrise. She baked bread every Sunday, read by the fire, sometimes sang to herself while folding linens, never expecting applause, but never silencing her voice again either. Caleb built a rocking chair just for her, wide and sturdy, with room enough for a quilt and a cat. On summer nights, he'd bring her lemonade and sit beside her, not saying much. They didn't need to talk all the time. They'd said the most important things and how they stayed. Surrey. One afternoon, a girl from town knocked on the door. She was 17, nervous, thin as a twig. They said you were the one to ask. She said, if I wanted to survive. Eleanor looked at her, not just at her clothes or the bruise fading under her eye, but into her soul. And without a word, she opened the door wider. She made tea, gave the girl a blanket, let her rest. And when Caleb came in muddy from mending fence, he simply nodded at the extra plate on the table and washed his hands in silence. Love wasn't a performance in this house, it was the rule. Siwer Durham. On their 10th anniversary, Eleanor sat beside the old white oak tree behind the house, the one that bloomed stubbornly each spring. She looked at her hands, at the soft wrinkles forming at her knuckles, the silver streak in her braid. I'm not what people expect when they picture a love story, she murmured. Caleb, standing behind her, put a calloused hand on her shoulder. Good, he said, because we made our own. They didn't need to be anyone's idea of romance. They had survived what most only read about. Shame, rejection, fear, and still they had chosen kindness. They had chosen each other. And so in that quiet corner of Wyoming, where wildflowers grew between fence posts and owls made homes in barn rafters, they lived, not perfectly, but honestly. And when folks asked Eleanor how she found her happy ending, she always said the same thing. I didn't. She'd smile warm and real. I built it. One slow, painful, beautiful piece at a time. This was never just a story about a mail-order bride or a broken proposal. It was about the women this world casts aside and the soft, steady hands that lift them up again. Love doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's a chair built by hand, a dinner made in silence, a touch that says, I see you. Life lesson from Eleanor's story. Eleanor's journey reminds us that love isn't just for the young or the flawless. Sometimes it finds us after decades of silence, after the world has called us too much or not enough. This story speaks to every soul who's ever been rejected, not because of who they were, but because others couldn't see their worth. Too often, women in their middle years are told their time has passed, but Eleanor's quiet strength proves otherwise. She teaches us that it's never too late to be seen, never too late to be chosen, not for your looks or your usefulness, but for your heart. This is a reminder to all of us, especially those who've spent years giving to others, that we still deserve kindness, respect, and a love that does not flinch. Real affection isn't loud. It shows up, it stays, it listens. Let Eleanor's story be a soft whisper in your heart. You are still worthy of being loved just as you are. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, None, Wild West Saga. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love doesn't have an age limit. And if you've ever been quietly brave like Eleanor, leave a comment. We'd love to hear your story. Let's keep these stories alive for every woman who's ever been overlooked and every man who's ever loved her anyway.